Good morning, everybody. Wednesday, isn't it? 28th, I think, of April, almost at the end of the month. And looking out the window this morning, the April showers have finally arrived after almost a month or so of actually fairly fantastic spring weather. We're back to what we normally get at this time of year. Anyway, what have we got for you today? Got a fairly packed show. I'll be starting off with a look at Ducati, who are going back into limited production in Italy, which is good news. We'll have a look at something that's perhaps not quite so good news, the report from the Asphalt Association and MAG, Motorcycle Action Group, on the state of the roads. We'll look at something that's been going on a bit behind the scenes in terms of electric motorcycles involving Japanese manufacturers. And last but not least, I'll be looking at how we actually see the scene around us. I'll be looking at the way our vision actually works to tell us what's going on. Okay, so don't forget, if you have something that you want to comment on, do drop me a line via the comments box here, and I'll get back to you at the end of the show. If you've got any suggestions or feedback on what we're doing here, I'm more than happy to read those and try and fit in with what people want as well. Okay, so I'll just start very quickly, though, with a little bit of news about what I've been up to. Over on my coffee page, that's ko-fi.com, and then survival skills. I was struggling to remember what the URL was, and I write it so often, but I'd forgotten what it was. I've added 2 extra tiers of content. There's always going to be free content here on Facebook. There'll be free content over on Coffee. There's some on my WordPress page as well, and there's riding tips on the website. But I've introduced 2 tiers of extra content over there on Coffee for supporters and subscribers. Basically, supporters, anybody who's put some money onto that site will get 30 free days of access to my back catalogue of Facebook posts. Now, I've already put up 2014's skills on Saturday and tips on Tuesday posts, and that comes to 100 posts, 100 articles. That's a lot of reading. If you put that into paperback form, it would actually make a paperback of around about 350 pages. So it would be a really hefty piece of reading for you. Over the next few days, I'll be adding 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018, and 2019. So there's going to be one heck of a lot of back content over there that you can access. If you subscribe, that is making a regular payment of as little as £3 a month, then you'll get access to all that for as long as your subscription runs, plus another tier of content which I'm working on at the moment. That'll include better biking videos. It'll include the basics of my advanced course online as well. I'll be having another crack at getting that into a place where people are happy to see it. So, okay, that's what I'm up to. What's been going on outside in the world? Well, one good bit of news, as I mentioned, is that Ducati have resumed production. The startup began on Monday, and at the moment, they're just allowing the minimum number of employees into the factory to restart their production and research activities. And they're going to be following, predictably, a rigid safety protocol, and that will involve the mandatory wearing of masks as well as distancing. Claudio Domenicali, he's the CEO of Ducati. He said, it's absolutely essential to pay close attention to strict compliance with safety procedures. The virus has not disappeared. The work done jointly with the Emilia-Romagna region has been important. It will be an extremely difficult year, but starting up again is still a beginning. We have a lot of orders for the Street Fighter V4, for the Multistrada GT and the Panigale V2. The motorbike is a perfect vehicle for phase 2. No parking problems and distancing guaranteed, safety and fun at the same time. Well, yes, well, okay, maybe that's a bit of marketing hyperbole, but it's good news. Ducati suspended their production at their Bologna plant on Friday the 13th of March. Initially, it was to reorganize production schedules, but as the Italian government locked down on non-essential businesses, they never did get that reorganization done. So basically now the improvement in the health condition in Italy has allowed the government to allow certain companies to restart production. These are ones that are deemed strategic for the national economy. To put it another way, those are the ones whose production is aimed mostly at exports, and they will be back in work. At the moment in Ducati, anyone who can carry out their work from home will continue to carry out their work from home. So basically that's resources such as the marketing, IT, personnel management, finance, purchasing and logistics. That's all still being carried out remotely. It's the production side of things that has to take place in the factory, which is going ahead. And what they've done to allow for increased distancing between workers is they've moved from an 8-hour shift to two 7-hour shifts, so they can get the minimum number of people in the plant, but for a longer time. They will have a canteen, for example, but this will allow them to seat people much more further apart, much more widely. The CEO says, we're ready to go. We've worked hard over the last few weeks to minimize any risk. Despite this, we will have to be extremely cautious and rigorous. So basically, visits to the factory will still be off limits. That will be the touring visits, but it also means that suppliers, dealers, representatives from companies that they normally work with will all still be prohibited from going to the business. So anyway, good news is that Ducati are at least back up and running in a limited fashion. So just a reminder that you're watching Survival Skills, Kevin Williams here, and you're live with me on my webcast show called Elevenses. Still to come, we're going to look at the asphalt Association's report on the road surfaces and MAG's response to that. We'll be looking at electric motorcycles and how the Japanese factories are starting to come together with a common strategy. And I'll finish up with an item on how our biking vision works. Okay, so what's going on with MotoGP? Because that's another story that has been in the news recently. As you probably know, there are many sporting activities which have been obviously shut down completely, and those organisers are wondering how they can restart. And one of the suggestions which has been doing the rounds is whether or not they can operate as closed door events. That is, the event goes forward, but no spectators are allowed. And MotoGP and World Superbike Series organisers, Dorna, are investigating just that at the moment. What they've explained might happen is that the closed door races would allow only the organisers, the teams themselves, obviously medical personnel, and most essentially in some ways the press and TV crews to be at the races. There'd be no spectators, there would be no sponsors, and there would be not even any VIPs. And again, the idea is that you significantly reduce the number of people who are at any particular race, and there, in theory, that would minimize the risk of spreading the virus further. Dorna are also planning to secure COVID-19 testing kits, and the idea is that they would test everybody present at these races to identify quickly anybody who is positive and get them isolated before they can spread the virus around. Dawn have already talked to the race teams themselves to try to get an idea of how many people would be necessary to run a skeleton race crew for each event. And what they've actually said in a statement is, we're preparing a protocol together with the relevant authorities, for example, the Sports Council in Spain and the Italian Olympic Committee, in addition to different laboratories, with which to control the entire Grand Prix paddock. We've already commissioned through a company that is owned by Bridgepoint, who own Dorna, the possibility of having 10,000 coronavirus tests to test the entire MotoGP family before and after each day. In the scenario that we now contemplate, there would be closed door races with the least possible personnel at the circuits for everyone, teams and organisation. So at a MotoGP event, which obviously includes Moto2 and Moto3 and possibly Moto E, Dorna believe that the teams could possibly be reduced to between 25 and 40 people. And that would give around about 1,000 people at each event. Of course, you may be wondering why there's actually a push to get these events underway. Well, the answer is, of course, money, isn't it? Teams and sponsors alike have invested heavily in the 2020 season. And we have to remember that the spectators are no longer the main income stream for these events. If you've looked at the TV coverage of motorcycle racing over the last few years, one of the things you'll see is that far from being chock-a-block like they used to be, the stadiums are actually nearly empty in some events. Even the traditional sellout races in places like Spain and Italy have been going ahead with less than capacity crowds for the last few years. And quite frankly, some of the other events, the British Grand Prix, hasn't been well supported at all. So given that the TV rights are where the money comes from, then closed door event might seem feasible. And I'm sure there will still be questions that need to be asked. Most obviously, you're not just putting 1,000 people into a single venue in close proximity. There's the whole geographical issue that needs considering. First of all, the race teams themselves come from different countries, and you're having to bring them together into that single venue. So you are introducing people from all over the world to go to one location. And then there is the problem that that entire circus moves from border to border across the the lockdown points that have been imposed by national governments. So it will also need the national governments to have a think about how they are going to allow an event like this to occur. So really, whether this goes ahead or not isn't really going to be down to Dorna, I wouldn't think, but it will be largely down to how the individual nations where the GPs are hosted see the issue. All Dorna can do is try to make things seem as safe as possible. So, okay, whether lockdown will ease across the world and whether we'll see MotoGP sooner rather than later, I still have no idea what the answer to that is going to be, and I doubt anybody actually does. Okay, so just to remind you, you're watching Elevenses with Kevin Williams. Don't forget, if we can't ride, we can still read, and my paperbacks are available on my publisher site. Pop over there and have a look to see what's available. The paperbacks are being delivered. Now we're going to finish up with an item about vision, but before we do that, let's just have a look at what's been going on between the Asphalt Association and Motorcycle Action Group. Well, I'm sure anybody who's used the roads in the UK in the last few years, the last decade or so, will have noticed that our roads are steadily disintegrating. And this has been due to budget cuts that the councils have had to impose themselves on road repairs, simply because their own funding from central government has been reduced. Over the last 5 years, I have had to replace 2 tyres on cars which have been damaged by potholes. One was found at the MOT because it was on the inside of the tyre where it's not easy to spot. The other was rather more obvious because there was a big bulge in the sidewall visible on the outside of the tyre. But it's not just tyre damage that can occur. You can actually get a blowout in a car, and actually my partner's had 2 in that period of time, resulting from hitting big potholes. And of course, motorcyclists and cyclists too are particularly vulnerable on 2 wheels, even if the tyre survives the impact. Now, research carried out by MAG is fairly alarming, because what they have shown is that on average, 4 motorcyclists die each year as a result of the poor road maintenance, and a further 70 suffer life-changing injuries. Now, that's above and beyond the number of people who have bikes that are damaged by crashes. Somebody I know through a motorcycle forum wrote his multistrada off around about a year ago, I guess. What happened was he was exiting a dual carriageway at speed, as you're supposed to do, onto the slip road, and he had to cross the seam between the tarmac, which makes up the surface on the exit ramp, and the tarmac, which makes up the main driving carriageway. What he couldn't see, because it was wet, was that where the 2 pieces of tarmac had been joined, which is normally covered by a sort of a liquid bitumen sealant to seal that joint, that seal had failed. And what in fact there was a long linear fail in the road surface. It was 3 or 4 inches deep and 3 or 4 inches across. In other words, just big enough for a front tyre to drop into. And at 70 miles an hour, the front tyre duly dropped into the crack as he was trying to travel across it at an angle, and he was thrown off the bike at 70 odd miles per hour. He was lucky, he was wearing decent kit, and apart from bruising, he survived without too much personal injury. The kit was a bit badly damaged and the helmet taking a bit of a battering. And the bike, well, it was written off. Big impact as the bike flipped over and completely trashed it. And the problem was that he then hit a wall when it came to getting compensation. Everybody passed the buck. The council said it's not our problem. You have to deal with the road engineers, the people who are responsible for maintaining the road, because it is all outsourced now. the road surfacing people said it's not our responsibility, it's the council's, and there was lots of buck passing. Well, eventually, I think he got a solicitor involved, and after a bit of toing and froing of official letters on letterheads, he did get compensation. But he still didn't get the compensation straightforwardly. He got a miserable offer for his bike, which was sort of below the lowest sort of level of that kind of machine you'd expect to find. And he had to, reject that offer and put in a counter offer. And eventually he got market value on the bike, but it was a bit of a struggle. So the thing that sort of frustrates me about this is that motorcycling is often represented as a dangerous mode of transport. We've seen that only too well with the recent hoo-ha from the Oxfordshire County Council engagement document for motorcyclists, which did the rounds last week. It shows just how strong the belief that it's motorcycling that's dangerous. But what's clear from the MAG figures, the MAG study, is that we're vulnerable, in part at least, because the road surface is so appalling. What their research shows is that, again, as that well-known figure that motorcyclists make up less than 1% of the total road traffic, motorcycles actually feature in 27.5% of all road traffic collisions where the road surface defect is listed as a contributory factor. And cyclists too are overrepresented, 14.7% in their case. So just how bad have things gone? This is where the Asphalt Industry Association's annual report comes into play, because they now argue that the one-time spend that would be necessary to catch up on the lost maintenance over the last few years and get the roads back into a reasonable state is no less than £11.14 billion. And that's up from 9.79 billion. So you can see the kind of shortfall that there is in the road maintenance budget. It's gone up by over £1 million in a year. And it's not just the cost, of course, it's the delay in actually getting these repairs in place. The more repairs that need doing, the longer it will take. And they reckon now that the maintenance backlog would actually take 12 years to clear, even if the local authorities had the funding and resources to do the work. Now, MAG's Director of Campaigns and Political Engagement, Colin Brown, says that for most four-wheeled motorists, an encounter with a pothole will result in damage, expense, and inconvenience. Well, okay, if you get a blowout, it's cost be a little bit more serious than that, but I take his point, because he goes on to say, for motorcyclists, the consequences can be fatal. And he says this year's report will bring no comfort to motorcyclists. Seeing the catch-up costs to get the road back into a reasonable state increased by 1.35 billion in just 12 months clearly shows that the current pledge of 2.5 billion over 5 years will have only limited impact. He carries on and says, we fully recognise the immediate need to prioritise the coronavirus pandemic, but hopes that the Chancellor will be in a position to make funds available when things return to normal. Will funds be available? Good question. Excuse me. It's hay fever time. So, okay. Right, so, whether we'll get back to normal on the roads anytime soon, I suspect is highly unlikely. Anyway, don't forget, you can join me for Elevenses every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and Sunday at 11 a.m. BST. And if you can't catch me live, you can catch up here on my YouTube channel, which is Survival Skills UK. Full story then, on to the final story of the day. Now, I mentioned Actually, I've put one extra story in today, haven't I already? I'll skip the electric bikes one. I can come back to that on Friday, and I'll move on to the other story that I was going to cover, which is vision. Now, I've just lost it. Where have I put it? Yes, here we go. Right, okay. So one of the puzzles that's exercised motorcycling minds for some time is how we actually see things out on the road. Now, if you have read any of my stuff, you'll regularly find me mentioning something called target fixation. Target fixation is implicated in a lot of bike crashes. The post-crash analysis suggests that the rider had time and space to take evasive action, but for some reason didn't. And the problem of target fixation is often used to suggest a possible solution to this. So what actually is target fixation? Well, it's an attentional phenomenon where we become so focused on one particular task that we actually forget to look away from what we're looking at. In the case of a vehicle on the road, the result is a collision because we end up looking at what we want to avoid. The term actually seems to have come from World War II fighter bomber training. That's what Wikipedia says anyway. What they found was that when they were using low-level bombing or strafing runs, that the pilots tended to fly straight into the target. They were so focused on what they were aiming at, they forgot to pull up and avoid it. Now, we have a similar kind of problem on the motorcycle, but for a slightly different reason. We're usually trying to avoid something that we target fixate on, whereas the fighter pilot was actually aiming at it. Now, how is there the same problem but with a different cause? Well, the answer is the way that the brain works. We tend to focus on objects of interest, and in the case of the fighter bomber pilot, the object of interest was the target. In the case of the motorcyclist, the object that grabs our attention is something that poses a threat of personal harm. The moment we feel we're under threat, we tend to look at whatever is posing that threat, whether it's a tiger or whether it's a car pulling out of a side turning. We get target fixated and then we respond just like the fighter pilot. We tend to fly into the object we were trying to avoid. Okay, that's the problem. How can we avoid it? Well, one suggestion comes from a book called Twist of the Wrist 2, which was written by an American rider coach that you may again have heard me mention regularly, Keith Code. Now, what he proposed was something he described as widescreen vision. And basically, he said that if we focus on an object directly in front of us, something like our finger, and then we kind of unfocus our vision on our finger, what we'll find is that we actually take in more of the detail to either side. Now, the theory is interesting. Sat in an armchair, it even seems to work. You can find something on the wall if you want and focus on that, and then try and sort of blur your vision, defocus, and take in what's going on in peripheral vision. That theory's gained some traction. I saw a YouTube video just the other day by another rider coach, an American, suggesting much the same thing and talking about this blurring of vision to start gaining this information about what's going on in periphery. He says that the problem is that our brains get overloaded with too much visual information, and then it's hard to focus and concentrate, and we miss the important things. And he uses the example of a deer crossing the road. And he says that if we just blur our vision, then we can see in that peripheral vision, and we'll pick up the important details like people, cars, or the deer. Now, does it work? Well, I have to say that when I read Keith Code's book, I tried this out years ago. And what I found was as soon as I got onto the road, I couldn't do it. It was easy enough sitting in an armchair when there was no change in what was going on in the background. There was nothing dynamic happening. I was simply focused on a static scene, and then yes, I could easily blur my vision. But the moment I got onto the road, there were things moving, and this is the big problem. This is actually how our vision works. Our attention is always drawn towards objects that jump out of the visual scene at us. And one of the reasons for that is the way that our vision works. We have what's called a narrow zone of foveal vision. The foveal vision is literally just a couple of degrees across, and it's a little narrow cone that comes out, and it's right in the middle of our visual field, and it's where our gaze focuses. You heard that term, you focus on something. Well, this is why. Because we have this very narrow cone of clear, focused color vision. As soon as we get out of that, even just a few degrees, we lose not only the focus, but we increasingly lose color vision as well. The brain does a really good job of inventing color and clarity, which isn't really there. And the problem is that only when we focus our gaze on something do we really pull it up in sharp definition. And that's the point at which we can identify things properly. The trouble with using peripheral vision to identify objects is that it can be fooled. Now, years ago, I was riding along down the road in Kent, typical country lane, with a cottage at the side of the road. And what did I see standing next to the hedge, just ahead of me, 100 meters or so in front? I saw a black bear. Now, you probably know that black bears don't live in Kent. So alarm bells went off in my head immediately to say, what have I just seen? It's clearly not a black bear. So I had to focus in. I hit the brakes at the same time, rolled off the throttle, slowed down. But I had to visually focus with my eyes on what it was I'd seen. And as soon as I turned that foveal clear color cone of focus vision on it, then what I saw was a black bin at the side of the road, black wheelie bin standing up actually just at the edge of the driveway of the cottage that I was coming up to. And about 20 meters behind it, there was a black bin liner in the hedge at sort of head height. And the way they lined up, the bin liner sort of superimposed itself over the top of the bin, and the bin liner was waving around in the breeze. And it was that movement of the bin liner that made it look, for all the world, like I'd just seen a bear which had turned its head to look at me. So that was my brain making something up, the best guess it could from the information that it was getting in peripheral vision. As soon as I turned my clear, focused foveal vision on it, all became clear. And that's how our vision actually works. Things attract our attention. It can be bright lights, it can be a movement, or it can even be a shape that we have learned to recognize. In my case, it was that black bear. But once we've been alerted, once the brain has had its attention attracted, then our eyes automatically move to home in on that object and actually confirm what it was we saw. So the danger would have been that if that bear, if I hadn't spotted it, I would never have looked in that direction. I wouldn't have noticed that there was a bin or a black bag. It just wouldn't have come into my attention. And this is the danger, that if we focus too much on this idea of using peripheral vision to spot things, we will not pick up the information that we need to see to attract our attention to it and to have a really good look at it. And then what happens? Well, then, of course, we get surprised. Something like a car maybe emerges from the driveway and triggers these fear reactions, which actually trip up the target fixation that we're trying to avoid in the first place. So the minute we don't expect something to happen, corner tightening up, car turning across our path, patch of gravel on the road surface, the moment we haven't seen those and they leap into our attention, that's when we get surprised. That's when target fixation kicks in. So how do we avoid target fixation? Well, the answer is we have to see the problem before it becomes a surprise. And that means we actually really do have to physically scan around the scene. We have to know what we're looking for, and we have to know where to look for it. We have to know where gravel might be found on a corner. We have to search the road surface to see if there is gravel. Far from having too much detail and too many things that are overwhelming us, we actually need to go and get those bits of information to avoid them coming in a sudden rush and surprising us at the last minute. We need to search early, and we need to search in detail. That way, and only that way, are we going to have the information we need and avoid the surprise when we get closer to the hazard. And that means we have to learn strategies to deal with this. We need to learn how to search. We need to know what we're searching for and how we're going to evaluate what we're doing on the road. So, okay, to sum up then, avoiding the target fixation isn't about blurring our vision. It's not about this widescreen idea that Code talked about. It's actually about picking out pinpoints of information right across the scene. And that means we need to learn how to use our eyes properly. Right, okay. That brings us to the end of today's show. Amazingly, again, the time has flown. This will be going up on Facebook as a recording fairly shortly, and I will also make a point of getting it over to YouTube in due course. And last but not least, don't forget that that new content is available on my Ko-fi page. I'll get a link up for you to go and have a look at it. I'll be back on Friday. I'm desperately trying to remember which day of the week it is. More news, views, and tips on Friday. One bit of information: I hopefully am setting up an interview with somebody from Hideout Leathers to continue my series on CE approved clothing. That will hopefully run on Monday. More information about that on Friday, so put that in your diary. For now, thanks for watching, and hopefully see you on Friday. Bye for now.